Welcome back to part two of the Greek period. Today I am going to talk to you about the period that is known truly as the classical period in Greek history. I am also going to talk about philosophy and also show you a bit of the Greek art from the period. To start us off, we are actually going to talk about the Persian War. The Persian War is really the entire reason why Athens rose to such fame and such power. Now, when I left us off with the very early period of Greece, I mentioned that there was a period called the Dark Ages, where virtually all artistic activity ceased. There was no writing, there was no development of any technology. After the Dark Ages ended, people began moving back into the cities, and that's officially what marks the end of that period. The city, of course, that is going to rise to such prominence is going to be Athens. What happened that really helped them along was the Persian War. If you look closely at this map that we have, you will see that across the sea is the Persian Empire. You'll note that there are a lot of cities that line the coastline. You will see Ionia, Lydia, and Caria. Those were Greek territories because what happened is that they really began to spread the Greek Empire pretty wide and far. A lot of people during the Dark Ages migrated out, so a lot of them just settled along this coastline. Well, what happened is that Persia, who is right there, it's their neighbor, they decided that this coastal territory was really strategic because of trade routes. So they went in and they conquered Lydia, they conquered Caria, and then they went after Ionia. Now, at this point, these three areas are waving a flag and they're calling off for danger, danger, and they're asking the Greek cities across the water to come over and to provide assistance. That is actually why the Persian War happened. It's because of this conflict over this coastal territory. Now, the Persian Empire at this time, it is quite large. And what they decided to do is because Greek city-states were fighting them and trying to take this land back, they said, well, we'll not only take your coast, we'll cross the mainland and we will slowly work our way through your territory. So they literally crossed the mainland at the top and went through Thrace, they went through Macedonia, and they began working their way down into areas like Thessaly. You will note that on your map you have these cities or markings in red with sort of an X. These are the main battles that happened during the Persian War. So they got pretty far into the deep territory of the Greek land. One of the very famous stories that almost everybody has heard is the story of 300, the 300 Spartans that stood against Persia trying to protect a passageway that would prevent them from being able to do a full land scale invasion. There was a movie made about 300 and it portrays some accuracy, but the reality of what happened at the Battle of Thermopylae, which is where the stand occurred, is that yes, indeed, there were 300 Spartans, but there were also thousands of other Greeks that fought alongside them. And it is true that almost everybody who fought that day or over that period for the Greek states, they did get slaughtered. And Persia was able to push through this opening. What did happen, though, is a lot of back and forth. And where Greece began to make its huge stand was not really even on land, it was on the sea. There were some sea battles, especially one at Salamis, and the big battle at Marathon. What happens is that they are able to push Persia off the mainland. Now, Persia, at the end of the war, they are going to go away for a bit, but it does not necessarily mean that they're not going to come back. The conflict with Persia lasted for several decades. What's really important about the end of this war is that we welcome what we traditionally call the golden age of Greek history. Athens is the one city state that comes out of this war well ahead of everybody else. And the reason why is a lot of it is this strategy. There are things that they do that is very smart that helps them gain a lot of power and a lot of money. I do want to point out that we have hundreds of city states in Greece. Most of them are independent, they have their own government, their own culture. Because of that, the city states rarely united as they did in the Persian War. Usually, they were actually fighting among each other. The city state is called the polis. And how city states were generally formed is you had the top of a city, which is known as the Acropolis, means top of the hill. And most of the business matters actually happened in their marketplace, which was down the hill. It was called the Agora. And that is how almost every Greek city-state was actually formed. What we want to talk about in relation to this era is we want to talk about Pericles, who is an Athenian politician that really is responsible for Athens gaining all of this prominence. What happened post-war is that Athens and the other Greek city-states created what is called the Delian League. The reasoning behind this is that each city-state contributed money that was being put in a fund. And what it was used for was that if Persia decided to come back, they could fund their war without going into debt. Pericles, who is known in history as coming from a very wealthy family in Athens, he was a wonderful orator. So he was a great public speaker. He gained a lot of attention in government because of that. He is the one who suggested that Athens, who had taken a huge hit, a lot of their city had been destroyed by the war, he decided that Athens should take some of the funds from the Delian League and should help rebuild their own city. I think we can see why this is a problem because other city-states are going to get very angry about this and say, why can Pericles or why can Athens do this and we can't? But Pericles gets a lot of attention because he is ultimately responsible for Athens rising to such power. Their city became one of the most beautiful landmarks in all of Greece, and Pericles wanted Athens to represent their power and their strength. So in order to do that, he looked at buildings and said they need to be beautiful, they need to be huge, people need to feel intimidated when they come into our city gates. Now, the way Athens was set up is that it is technically called a democracy, and I put the word pure in quotation marks because it is not a true democracy. The people who had most of the power were the wealthy citizens of Athens. The only people who were allowed to vote were people who were free and they were land-owning citizens. There were more slaves in Athens than there actually were free people. So even though it is a form of democracy, we know that slaves are not allowed to vote. We know that women are also not allowed to vote. So the term democracy is sort of loosely applied here. An example I can give you of a woman who actually did have a lot of power is Aspasia. Aspasia was actually Pericles' consort. They are not sure if they ever truly married, but they did have a son together who became quite famous as a warrior. The reason that Aspasia stands out in history is because she sort of pops up in Athens, and there's a lot of questions about where she came from. Some people said that she was from Italy, but they're not really sure. Nothing was written down. They just know that she popped up in Athens around the era of Pericles, and what her occupation was, she was a prostitute. But she was a very high dollar prostitute. Prostitutes at this time, in a very strange way, had much more freedom than a normal woman would have. They were allowed to be educated. They were allowed to mingle in the marketplace with men, particularly in politics. They were allowed to be very vocal. And a lot of them had their own independent property. their own independent money. So in some ways, the prostitutes of this era are a lot more advanced and a lot more free than the ordinary Athens citizen. Now, if you talk about Sparta, which we will a bit later, Spartan women were far and away more advanced. A lot of the Spartan women had equal rights to men. A lot of them were warriors. So it just depends from city state to city state on how women were treated. But the norm was that women were to stay in the home and be domestic. They got married and they had children, and that was the limitation of their life. But Aspasia stands out as an example of a woman who really did achieve much, considering that we know so little about her. And even when Pericles was targeted, and he was eventually, you become that powerful, you are going to have people that just simply don't like you. When they went to attack him, they actually spread a lot of nasty rumors about Aspasia. So today we're not really sure what was true about her and what was false. Some people even dispute that she was not a prostitute. So it depends on the source that you actually read. To talk about what happens to Athens towards the end of their reign, I said that we would go to Sparta. So I'm going to briefly describe Spartan culture to you, and then we'll talk about why the Peloponnesian Wars actually happened. Sparta is known as an oligarchy. What an oligarchy is, it is a city or a government that is ran by very few people, basically an elite number make all the decisions for the citizens. Sparta is absolutely a warrior state. Young boys begin training when they are children, and when they become soldiers, everybody did who was a male. You were not in service for X amount of years. You were in service until you died. So anytime in your life, you could be called up to go to war. Sparta based their entire culture on the fact that they were warriors. It is something they were very proud of. So when you think of the story of 300, and if you've seen the film, you get a better idea of why there's such an emphasis on how they present themselves in battle. That is where their pride comes from. It is from their reputation as a fighter. So Sparta is very much a military-based community. Athens, who had fought in the Persian Wars, it is not that they could not fight, they could, but their emphasis was not on war. I mean, Sparta was, they started from children learning this. What happened that caused a conflict is that Athens had a target on its back. It's because of the Delian League. But what happened is that Athens decided to take sides in a dispute that Sparta had with another city-state called Corinth. Corinth and Sparta were enemies, and when Athens took Corinth's side, Sparta declared war on them. So what happened is that we have the Peloponnesian Wars. What happens is that Sparta is able to actually defeat Athens. Not only did they defeat them, they actually went into their city. That's very humiliating for Athens. They literally go from top of the world and then they fall really hard and really, really fast. What's very interesting is that rather than come into Athens and actually take over it permanently, create a Spartan government, they more or less came in and then they left. I think that Sparta's intention was to humble Athens, to rein them back in and prove to them that they were not as mighty and not as powerful as they had viewed themselves for many years. So Athens at this point becomes very obsolete towards the end of the Greek period. They really sort of fall into the shadows. And eventually we know that most of the empire is going to be broken up, and the empire who is really going to take possession of the region is going to be Rome. You really cannot talk about this history without mentioning Alexander the Great. If you remember on the map that we looked at during the Persian War, I mentioned as I was crossing over the mainland, and I mentioned Thrace, but I also mentioned an area called Macedonia. That is where Alexander was actually from. Alexander is going to be remembered as one of the most famous leaders and especially war leaders and history. He is still referenced today. There are many great military leaders who have referenced Alexander as an inspiration. Basically, to understand Alexander, you have to know where he comes from. He was a prince of Macedonia. His father was actually the ruler. What is really interesting about Alexander's birth is that his mother, who was sort of known as a very crazy lady, what she did is that when Alexander was born, she told this very sort of fantastic story about how he was conceived. What she said is that when she married Philip, that's Alexander's father, Olympias, his mother, said that on their wedding night, her womb was struck by a lightning bolt, that she had this vision of it happening. So if you think about which god we talked about is associated with thunder and lightning, we know that it is Zeus. So basically what she was claiming is that Philip was not really the father of Alexander, it was actually Zeus. So from the moment this kid was born, he was being told that he was a demigod. So you can imagine the ego he grows up with, that his mom said, yes, you are Zeus's child. His mother was kind of a creepy character. People were very afraid of her in Macedonia. She was known to have a fascination with serpents, so she carried snakes with her frequently. And I will tell you that her husband eventually got rid of her. Apparently, he was a little bit afraid of her too. And what she did is when she got left by her husband, she actually told Alexander that his father wanted to kill him. There's no evidence that Philip did, but what did happen to Philip is that he was actually assassinated. It was believed to be within the ranks of his own military. They decided to get rid of him. So Alexander literally took the throne when he was still a very young man. He really was about 20 years old. And he knew about military life from his father. He went on campaigns with him when he was just a little boy. Alexander, to prove how his mother's sort of nuts, when they came back, Olympias actually took Philip's new consort and actually had her burned alive as a punishment. So like I said, she's kind of a kooky mother. But Alexander gets this title, the Great, because one, he created this vast empire, which really resembles what we see from Rome. But more importantly, he never lost a military battle during his life. He was undefeated. He was actually tutored by the philosopher Aristotle. So he learned warfare. He learned a lot about culture as he was growing up. What happens to Alexander is he dies when he's still very young. He gets very sick and he dies. It's not from any great battle loss or anything like that. He gets sick and he dies. And when he dies, his empire is virtually broken up and lost throughout history. But this guy still appears in history books. He's still talked about today because of this very short but fantastic legacy that he left behind. We are going to switch and talk a little bit about Greek philosophy. One of the first stories I will tell you is about a place that we just simply call the Greek sacred sanctuaries. And the one that I've chosen to introduce you to is known as Delphi. This is a real site. It was believed by the Greeks to be a sanctuary for the god Apollo. The reason why is that you see this image on the right where it looks like we have some sort of dragon serpent creature that has been struck with an arrow. That is Apollo on the left. I mentioned Apollo is a sun god, but he's also associated with arrows. When he was very much younger, some people say as a child, he had heard this story about this very sacred place where a serpent monster had taken possession of it, and the people that lived around the sanctuary were terrified of it. So he went there when he was young, and he actually slayed this monster, and that is why the sanctuary is named after him. It was dedicated to him. This was a real place that the Greeks would visit, and what actually happened there is you had priests and you had priestesses. They were there to tell the Greek people what the prophecies were. So on the left here, you see a female woman who is sitting on a throne. She is called an oracle. And what would happen is that people would come in and they would give some money to the priest, and then the oracle or this priestess would begin to tell prophecies. You notice in the image there's gas coming up from the ground or some sort of fumes. They believed that she would go into a trance, and what the fumes were, it was actually the carcass of this dead serpent that had fallen through the ground when Apollo slayed it. So the fumes come up from the body, and then she is able to consume them, and she goes into a trance and she tells people prophecies. There are real fumes that come from the ground, but it's gas, which basically means that when she would sit there, she would get really, really high, and then she would start blubbering nonsense, and the priest would be the translator and tell people that, oh yes, she says this is what's going to happen. It basically is one big phony system. It is an easy way to get money from people. And later on in history, it shut down because the Greeks realized that none of the prophecies were coming true and that they were lying to them. But it's very interesting because for a long time they believed in Delphi. It was one of the most sacred sites that they actually had. So with that, we are going to talk just briefly about a few of these very famous philosophers. There is a trio of Greek philosophers. Socrates is the first one, and then we will talk about Plato, and then we will end with Aristotle. Now, Socrates, he is sort of the father of a lot of Greek wisdom. What's really important to note about him is that nothing was actually written down while Socrates was alive. We know everything we do about him from Plato, who was a student, and he wrote a lot about Socrates. What Socrates is known for is the dialectic model. That is also known as the Socratic method. That means that if you're in a classroom, the teacher will pose questions to the students rather than give them answers, because the idea is to make you think out solutions by yourself rather than just finding the answers out from your teacher. What is the most important story about Socrates is actually how he died. You see that I put up there, he was forced to commit suicide. So we're going to look at an image here from 18th century art, which will help us out a bit. Socrates was a teacher. That is the best that we know about him. There is a military record for him, so he probably served at some time. But Socrates was a teacher, and that is actually what got him into trouble. There is a very famous story that Socrates had actually visited the oracle, so I think we already know he's probably in trouble. And the oracle told him that he was the wisest person living in Greece. He came back to Athens and he began to ask people the same question. Do you really think I'm the wisest guy here? He apparently got into some arguments with some very wealthy gentlemen who felt that Socrates was trying to make them look very ridiculous. So what happens is that it goes from this guy asking questions to the next thing we know, he's being accused of corrupting the Athenian youth. Basically, it's similar to a charge of heresy. Now, Socrates was an old guy when he was put on trial, and he knew that he would probably be convicted. Plato wrote a really wonderful work called Apology, which is all from the transcript of Socrates' trial. But what happened is that he was sentenced to death. Socrates decided to take hemlock. That is a poison, and that's why they say that he was forced to commit suicide. He actually did have another option where they believe that he was given a chance to go and live out his life in exile, but he decided to take the poison. If you think about the symbolism of this, it means that Socrates was willing to die for his beliefs. This is an attribute that is going to be admired centuries later, which is why I mentioned that this painting comes from the 18th century. The reason why is because the artist, a man known as David, he did this during the French Revolution. And if you notice Socrates, who is grabbing for the hemlock, he is standing very upright, he is very strong and very proud. And his followers, his students, they're all crying and weeping. Even in the background, you can see his wife and his children leaving. He has such a strong body language. It's like he's ready to die for what he believes in. These are his principles. So Socrates is quite a famous philosopher, and he really gets us going, speaking of the Greek philosophers. The next one is Plato. As I said, he was the student of Socrates. He is the one that wrote everything down. He is our authority for Socrates. But we're not sure how much of it is accurate because he really admired Socrates. So there may be some bias worked into his writings. I am going to talk about one significant theory of Plato, and it is known as the story Allegory of the Cave. But first, we will talk about theory of forms, which is related to Allegory of the Cave. Plato argued that in our minds, we are impacted by our perception of what is real and what is not real. Sometimes maybe our senses lead us into believing something is true that's not. Maybe, for example, we get our emotions involved. Maybe our sight misleads us. Maybe our hearing, or even our sense of smell. What Plato argues in Theory of Forms is that everybody's version of reality is only that. It's a version, it's a copy, and that our version of reality might not be real at all. The reason it's really important is because of his story of Allegory of the Cave. And you see that I put seeing is believing, but it is imperfect. I'm going to explain what Allegory of the Cave is, and I will give you the best film example from the modern period that I can use to help you with this. All right, so we have this image. On the left-hand side, we have these individuals that are lined up. The story is that these individuals were born in a cave. They have never been above ground. They have never seen sunlight. Not only that, but they have been chained to a wall their entire life. They have not been able to even turn around and see what is behind them. They face the wall day and night. Behind them, there is a roadway, and then behind the roadway, there is a pit that they light up at night to start the fire. Now, according to how they have lived, they have faced a wall. We know that when that fire is lit, what they will see on the wall is the reflection behind them. We're going to see shadows on the wall. Now, according to Plato, the people who walk the roadway, those shadows that are on the wall, those people are going to think that those shadows are real because it's the only thing they've ever known. They don't know anything different. Now, the experiment is that if we were to unchain them, we were to actually let them leave the cave, go up to the sunlight, the theory is that they would never be able to return back to the cave because they have been given a new version of reality, and also they have a brand new experience. With experience, we get wiser, and Plato would probably argue that we have a better version of reality and we're more aware to question. Now, I said that there's a film example I can give you. A modern film that actually uses Allegory of the Cave is the Matrix trilogy. Because if you think about what the Matrix is, it is a computer system that has created a version of reality. The people who live in the Matrix are not aware that their surroundings are fake. They think it's real. That is Allegory of the Cave. And Neo, our hero character, his entire purpose is to destroy the Matrix, to let people know that, hey, this isn't real. It's just a version of reality. You've been tricked. So the Matrix fits Plato's theory perfectly. The last philosopher I want to talk about is Aristotle. Aristotle is the tutor of Alexander the Great, and in many people's eyes, he's actually the greatest of all the Greek philosophers. And it's because of the many branches that he went off into, everything from science to mathematics to warfare to history. Now, Plato was his teacher. So we see how that works. We have Socrates, he is Plato's teacher. Plato is going to be Aristotle's teacher. Aristotle himself, I put that he was very much ahead of his time, but very strangely enough, he held humankind back for centuries. And this is very accurate. The reason that we actually say that, and I'll briefly tell you before we go to Greek art, is because he believed that the earth did not move. It's called geocentrism. Later on, the church would actually hold that theory to be true for centuries. And I am talking about the Christian church that comes out of Rome. They believed that the earth did not move. Now, we know today that it's the opposite. The earth moves and we revolve around the sun. But at the time, the church actually declared it to be heresy if you believed that the earth did move. So Aristotle's theory, which seemed so innocent at the time, it actually became the number one theory that the church held onto all the way up past Galileo. Poor Galileo, he actually was persecuted for proclaiming that the earth did indeed move. To finish us off today, we are going to talk just briefly about Greek art. Greek art can be as fancy as what you're seeing here on this slide, or it can be as basic as this. The very earliest type of art we're looking at is Greek pottery, and we have two styles. We have geometric and we have archaic. Now, it's kind of funny that we look at this today, seems so simplified as an art form, but these two classes of people used to argue with each other over what was the best type of pottery. Now, on the left, we call it geometric, simply because we have more simplified figures. They much more look like stick figures. We have a lot of geometric shapes and lines that make up the pottery. On the right, we have a more advanced pottery. We have people who have a lot more shape to them. We have more movement. We have a better attempt at depicting a realistic type of world or story. Pottery itself was really important to the Greeks. They not only used it as a vessel for water and oils, but they actually also used to take these pieces of pottery and they used to place them on graves. Usually there was a hole at the bottom of the pottery and they would pour all types of oils that were very ritualistic, and it was actually meant as an offering to the gods and goddesses. So we go from this pottery, and by the way, the one on the left, if you pay attention, this is how we know a lot about it being associated with death. It's actually a funeral procession that's actually going by on the pottery. So we have pottery. Then we have the very basic type of sculpture. So the first picture I showed you, which had this man waving his arms covered in serpents, a lot more advanced than what we're seeing here. This first one on the left is a kyros, which means young man, and then we have a kore, which is a maiden. You notice that the man is fully nude, while the woman is partially covered up with a fabric. Women were generally depicted as being clothed because they never showed up in public in the nude, and they were considered much more modest. Men are always depicted usually in the nude. The reason why goes back to the idea that they saw the male body as beautiful, and a lot of their sculpture pieces of men were actually a reflection of their view of the gods. So they would use Zeus and Poseidon as inspiration for their work. Now, the guy on the left does not stand very natural. I think that's what we would notice about him. We would hope nobody really stands like that. But I will tell you that foot moving a step forward, that was considered the biggest innovation that they had found up to that point. To actually add movement by having a person try to naturally have their foot forward. So we can imagine this person walking. I mean, to them, this was the greatest thing they had ever seen. We look at it today, we kind of laugh at it because it doesn't look natural. This poor guy who's very stiffly has his arms by his side, he looks very rigid. But at the time, this was advanced art. What we eventually get to is much more natural movement. The classical style is what this is called. This is being done around the height of Athens' fame. And what I just want you to note about the way the art moves, we notice that both of these sculptures have movement, but also it's because of the positioning of the body. The body looks more natural, it's better proportioned, looks more realistic, but also the piece on the left, he is leaning his body weight. It is a term called contrapposto, which means just a shifting of body weight to apply movement. The piece on the right is an athlete in motion. It's a discus thrower. So we actually have this inspiration from the Olympic Games, which again fits what we talked about last time. Now, Greeks were all about perfection, and this is applied across the board in their art. So when you see the words like harmony, order, reason, intellect, this is what their goal ultimately was. They wanted people to look natural. They wanted them to look accurate anatomically, and also the way that they were proportioned. We hit a period known as the Hellenistic Age, and this is actually the age of Alexander. The reason it's called Hellenistic is because the word Hellenistic, it means non-Greek. Because Alexander, he was not really considered Greek, but he really loved the Greek culture. So everywhere he went, he spread Greek art and Greek values. So we simply call this Hellenistic works. They're not really original to the classical period, but they are inspired by it. I think we see even more movement. The piece on the left is really quite wonderful. It is called Nike of Samothrace. Nike means victory, if you didn't already know that about the brand. So this was probably done for some sort of military victory. The movement is created not just simply by the fact that she has these lovely wings, but look at her gown and how it flows, these layers and layers of fabric. The male on the right, this is something also that's very key to the Hellenistic period. Natural emotion, having expression of emotion. He is known as the dying Gaul. So he is probably just moments from his death, and they are actually trying to draw you in emotionally so you connect to the piece. Now, unfortunately, we do not know who created a lot of these pieces. It's an unknown part of the Greek world. But we can say that they do naturally follow a pattern, and they also progress through time and get better and better. I'm going to end you today by talking about architecture. I just want to point out the columns. This is different from what we saw when we looked at the palaces from the early period. Basically, you have different types of column styles. The column styles are where the capital is. You notice the first one on the left is very basic. It is known as the Doric. This is what the Greeks used. This is their favorite type of column, and you can see it on the right where it's being depicted in the actual picture. The second type of capital is known as the Ionic, and the last one is the Corinthian. As you get to Ionic and Corinthian, they get lighter and lighter, and they get more decorative. The Corinthian was used by the Romans, not the Greeks. It was their favorite style, but the Romans used all three. The Greeks just used Doric mainly, and occasionally they used Ionic. The Acropolis is the most important architectural center, and this is in Athens. So the image that you're actually seeing is a reconstruction of what the Acropolis probably looked like at its glory. The main building is the Parthenon, but I will tell you very briefly that we have three other structures here. We have the Athena Nike on the bottom right. That is the smallest of the buildings. And as we already learned, Nike means victory. Athena is their patron goddess. So more than likely, this was for some sort of victory. And it may have been actually dedicated to military victories in general. The Propolia was a gallery. And they believe that if you were visiting Athens, you would want to be taken there because they had a gallery that depicted the history of Athens. It's almost like a history museum. Now, the Erechtheion, which is on the top left, that probably has the most interesting story. It actually deals with Athena, but there was a god that they believe was a ruler named Erechtheion, and he was a child of Athena. Now, Athena was hailed because she was also known as a virgin goddess, but there is a story that she was almost raped, and that the male who tried to rape her actually dropped part of his bodily fluids, to put it very nicely, into the earth, and out of that came this child that she called Erechtheion. It's sort of like the scandalous story behind Athena's history, but it is very interesting. Now, the Parthenon, at its glory, was considered the most beautiful structure that they actually had in Greece. And you see that this image shows paintings on the outside of it. They believe they had this gigantic statue of Athena that was actually in the building itself. Unfortunately, so much of it has been lost. The Parthenon has not survived very well, and even foreign governments have had to intercede to try to help fix it. But what's really cool about the Parthenon is the way that it is built. If you are looking at it, it looks perfect. That's what the Greeks are about, perfection. It has columns that are the same height, same width. They are separated exactly the same amount apart, the same number on all the rows and different sides. What happened, though, is that it's a bit of an architectural trick. It looks perfect, but it's really not. It actually is a little bit off center. It's the only way that the columns can actually hold the entire structure. So over time, you see that it has basically just turned to rubble. It's really quite sad. But at its height, this was their most famous work. This is the work they were proudest of, and this was all being done using the Delian League funds during the age of Pericles. All right, so this is going to end our Greek lecture. Eventually, we will pick back up with classical Rome.